Here we are. George Elliott Clarke, Poet Laureate of Canada, of Toronto. Your most recent book, Where Beauty Survived, a memoir of race, family, secrets, and Africadia, 2 years ago this summer.
Yes.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invite, Jaya. It's so good to be here. It looks like it's a very comfortable sofa. And I can tell you in my personal experience right now, it's a very comfortable sofa
Sofa Reviews by George.
in your beautiful, beautiful home. Thank you for having me here.
The Dialexicon interviews are short, so we settle into a sort of the space of listening is my area of curiosity. So I'll let there be pauses, and we can just sink into the moment together. The first question I'm going to try out: what does it mean? What does it mean to you to be an artist in a time when we may be preparing for nuclear war?
The question that you ask is a very grave question, and it may strike some viewers as being unduly alarmist and even ridiculous and so on. But for anyone who is aware of contemporary world history, even since 1945, and the division of the world into major trading blocs and military alliances, I think that anyone who comes to this question, your question, with that knowledge base would have to be alarmed right now, without being alarmist, but I mean, really deeply concerned and worried about the open aggression, even just simply in terms of diplomacy, diplomatic speech, not to mention the ongoing wars, not only in Ukraine, but also in Yemen, other parts of the world, where there continue to be grave divisions over resources, access to resources, as well as economic entitlements, and so on, or what people perceive as being their entitlements to economic growth. I think we have to be deeply concerned, especially when, as we're speaking right now in July 2023, we just had the American president circumvent American law in order to be able to send missiles loaded with cluster munitions to Ukraine, to be used against potentially, well, most likely Russian forces, but which will ultimately have or produce a great deal of so-called collateral damage. I mean, in plain talk, the murders of innocent civilians, when these munitions left over from whoever this conflict ends up, detonate in trees and fields and in playgrounds, hidden under debris, rubble of one sort or another, and they start going off everywhere because they're indiscriminate in the damage that they can inflict. We've got 120 countries who have banned these things, so we don't want these things, including Canada. But Canada is a de facto ally of the United States, if not in some ways a kind of vassal state of the United States, unfortunately, right now under our current leadership. I won't deviate too much in answering your question, but I will say I miss Papa Trudeau as opposed to Baby Trudeau. I miss Pierre, because at least Pierre undertook, to a certain extent, an independent foreign policy, undertook a policy of peace as opposed to enabling war, which is where we are now, undertook a policy of non-confrontation and non-interference in other states' affairs, unlike the current leadership. And I'd have to say that in this case, it appears that the apple has fallen quite far from the tree. That's just my personal opinion, but to answer your question more directly, I think it's the responsibility of everyone who is, to a certain extent, awake and alive, to be cognizant of where we seem to be drifting, or where we seem to be in the process of being pushed. And I won't go back very far. I'll just go back 20 years to remind our viewers that when the United States decided, in particular, along with Tony Blair, the lapdog of the United States, that we, the coalition of the so-called willing, needed to invade Iraq to dislodge Saddam Hussein, who was supposedly building nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, that the whole world was browbeaten, propagandized, bullied into supporting a great assault on human rights, a great travesty in terms of war crimes upon the people of Iraq. And that the same kind of indoctrination, propagandizing, and bullying is going, and harassment is going on right now to try to convince the vast majority of the planet that China is the great threat to world peace, world economic growth, climate change catastrophes, and their amelioration or prevention. This is what we're being pushed to believe, especially by major press, mass media, and organs of Western government, and so on. And I want to call that out right now as being simply a poet, as this is a great lie, and we would all be extremely endangered to fall prey to it. And it's the job of artists always to be asking questions and probing deeper, which is not to say that I or any other artist has all the answers or knows everything. Absolutely not. But I do think that we are called upon as intellectuals to try to question and probe and think twice about the truths, in quotation marks, the truths that are handed down to us for our consumption, and to accept them as being valid. Because again, to come back to the Iraq example, we all now know 20 years later what a great colossal lie that was, and why George W. Bush is not himself sitting in a little glass box in The Hague on trial for war crimes can only be understood by the fact that the American government never signed on to the war crime treaties, war crime prosecution treaties, but are themselves the very first people on the planet to accuse others of war crimes when they know they will never be called to justice themselves. And yet they should all be there. They should all be there. How dare they get up on their high horse? And in fact, I should call it, I don't want to endanger the reputation of any animal by comparing the United States to a high horse. It should not be a horse. It should be get up on their high Tyrannosaurus Rex. Get up on their high T-Rex and talk about anybody else's war crimes when they still have not been called to account for their criminal war against Vietnam, just to name one. I know it's a long time ago now, but it's not in terms of how we plan for the future. Our planning for the future is never for 5 years or 10 years. It's always for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. The economic planners, the war gamers right now in Washington, in London, maybe even in Ottawa, they're not just thinking about conflicts right now or conflicts next year. They're thinking about what's the world going to look like 100 years from now when very few of us are going to be around. What's the world going to look like 100 years from now? Will the United States still be number one 100 years from now? These are the questions that they are asking each other or trying to figure out for themselves in order to position their respective nations to be still in the vanguard, to still be number one, if at all possible. But they do that planning now. You know, we never see it. We don't hear about it. But those war games, those plans are being carried out now, secretly. One country against another. One country against another, or one alliance against another. And Canada itself is the result of war preparations. You know, we never think about it that way, but we all know that Confederation came about partly because of the fact that Britain had defended the Confederacy, had been allied with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. When the Civil War ended, the Union Army had 1 million armed men in it, the Union Army, at the end of the American Civil War, 1 million. And there were members of the American Congress who thought, you know what, Britain interfered in our Civil War. They backed the losing side, the Confederacy. We should just march north and grab Canada. British North America as it was then. And so the British put pressure on the Canadian or the British North American colonies, is that you got to join together here because there's a real threat here of armed aggression from the United States towards you all. So you better start to unify and join together. Um, but when we finally did, when Confederation finally began in 1867, there was a second line in the original BNA Act. Nobody ever, it was repealed in 1911 by Laureate, right? But there was a second sentence in the original British North America Act of 1867 that says that the reason why this union of these British North American colonies is taking place is to promote the interests of the provinces, but also the interests of the British Empire. That's the second sentence. Canada is being put together to promote the interests of the British Empire. What was one of those interests of the British Empire? To basically block American expansionism. Block it. And that's why you look at a map of North America today, Canada sits east and west as a kind of stopper atop the United States.
Cork.
Yeah, we are Cork. We are a Cork atop the United States, blocking its northern expansion. If that had not happened and Canada or colonial British North America had become part of what is now the United States of America, it would be even far greater an imperialist power and threat to world peace than it already is. If Britain had not, because when the British war planners, imperial planners in the mid-19th century looked around the world, they had globes back then. They were spinning the globe back then. And they were thinking to themselves in the 1860s, what nations could rise to threaten British dominance, the empire upon which the sun never set? What nations are out there that could actually rival our power? Now, they had an agreement with France, the Great Entente of 1814, 1815. So after Napoleon was dislodged, so France was no longer a threat to British power worldwide. And so when they looked around the world, they only saw two threats. Two. One was reunified Prussia, Germany. They said, Germany could be a threat to us. They could see that in the 1860s with Bismarck. Germany, we got to keep an eye on Germany. That could be a real threat to us because of Germany's position on the European continent. And the other country they saw as being a potential rival to their power was the United States in the 1860s, which is the reason why they allied themselves with the Confederacy. Not because they wanted to maintain slavery in the American South. Not they could have cared less about that, because they could have cared less about that. But it's because they wanted to keep the U.S. split. So that the U.S. could not rise as an industrial power to threaten their own industry and their own economic power, right? So, and so part of that is forming Canada as a means to inhibit American expansionism. One last little coda to all this: the Spanish-American War, 1898. Right, which is probably a war that was instigated by the Americans with the potential blowing up of the USS Maine. The Maine did blow up in Havana Harbor. It blew up, but how did it blow up? Why did it blow up? Did it blow up because the Spanish in control of Cuba were attacking the Americans, which is what the Americans claimed, or did the Americans blow it up themselves, or was it simply an accident? Because of the cargo that they were carrying, that the ship blew up, and then that became an excuse for America to go to war with Spain. In the prosecution of that war with Spain, 1898, the U.S. grabs Cuba, grabs Philippines, right? It's like, oh, we're going to grab these Spanish possessions, and then Britain, 1898. This is so cool. This is why understanding history is so important, because note the date, 1898. So America wins its war with Spain, grabs all these Spanish possessions, including Cuba, right? The British, sitting in London, are looking at all this and saying, uh-oh, this means the Americans have their eye on the Caribbean, on the British West Indies. And so the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it was back then, reacts to the American victory by doing a couple things. First, they say to Canada, the Dominion of Canada, we need you to grow sugarcane. This is all true. It's in the History of Canadian Business, published in 1975 by Naylor, Naylor. Britain asked Canada to grow sugarcane, and the attempt was made here in Ontario, in Quebec, and in New Brunswick. The attempt was actually made to grow sugarcane in the northern reaches of North America. But the reason why Britain asked Canada to do that was they were afraid that the Americans were going to grab British West Indian islands, nations, colonies, as they were back then. But Britain does something else as well. It asks Canada, the Dominion of Canada, to become the new imperial power in the West Indies. So for 50 years, 50, for 50 years, from 1898 to 1948, there were secret talks between London and Ottawa about Canada becoming the imperial master of the British West Indies. 50 years. It came to an end in 1948 when Mackenzie King, probably being influenced by his late mother speaking through his dog, yeah, because remember, that's why he was Canada's most successful prime minister, 22 years in office, was because he got advice from his German Shepherd. I mean, his mom was speaking through his German Shepherd, giving him political advice. Anyway, so Mackenzie King gets this advice, I guess, from his mother through his dog to say, okay, we don't want to be the new white man carrying the burden of empire in the West Indies, and says, no, we're not going to take over Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados and Antigua and Grenada and so on. We're not going to do it. But what Canada does obtain as a result of, partly as a result of not doing the West Indies thing for Britain, is Newfoundland, 1949. So the secret talks end in 1948, but Newfoundland, which was still at that point a separate, independent colony of Great Britain and under direct rule from London, as of the installation of commission government in the 1930s, because of the great economic hardship that Newfoundlanders experienced as a result of the Great Depression. Then Newfoundland gets stick-handled into the Canadian column, because while it was still simply a colony of Great Britain, the Americans had an Air Force base in Newfoundland. For all the talk, I got to say this, for all the talk of great Anglo-American, Canadian-American cooperation, I hope I'm right about this. The Americans have no bases in Canada. They have no armed forces bases in Canada, no military bases in Canada. Right, which we should all be, I think, really, really feel good about. And God help us if they ever get permission to have an armed forces base in Canada. Right? I mean, it's bad enough that they already have dibs on what we can export. I didn't know about that until earlier this year when it came out that the Americans have agents embedded with Canadian border services in order to make sure that we are not accidentally, and the Canadian businesses are not accidentally breaking American sanctions on one foreign country or another. So the Americans actually have oversight over what we export right now. And all this was done without any input, as far as I know, from Parliament or from the Canadian people. We're going to allow a foreign power to tell us on our own soil what we can export and to whom we can export it. This is a major violation of our sovereignty. But of course, baby Trudeau is okay with that. Papa Trudeau would never have let that happen. But baby Trudeau is okay with it. Not a problem. So long as there's a photo op at the end of it. You know, I'm sorry, because I like him too. I like him. Just like I like Obama. I like them both. But it doesn't excuse the fact that they, as far as I'm concerned, have both been parties to very injurious decisions in terms of Canada, in terms of our sovereignty, but also in terms of foreign relations and foreign policy. This is a long, rambling answer to your great question, but I do think that artists, intellectuals, and I believe all writers are intellectuals, that we are called to provide a kind of senatorial, sober second thought on many, many issues and problems.
Thank you. So the second question is where I hand back a word that stood out from your first answer. So I have a couple with the stars. You talked about being, because I get such a beautiful global sense of the movement and the pressures, the pulls and pushes. And you said cognizant to where we're being pushed. And I have that sense of, the artist's sensitivity to where pressures, as they emerge out of language or out of behavior and with the precedent of history. But you also said excuse for war. And I really have the sense of how, the war is locked and loaded. And then it just needs that excuse to pull the trigger. And I wonder if you want to sink into what that excuse means, what it means to have an excuse, or something about being pushed. So pushed or excuse. That's where I landed.
Well, it's a great question, and again, look at world history is world judgment. Hegel. It comes from him. World history is world judgment. We want to understand how people really behave. We look at the history of ourselves as human beings and as nations and as civilizations. How have we acted towards each other over time? And again, we don't have to go back very far. We can just go back, for instance, to 1965. What happens in 65 is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where LBJ, all the way with LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson is the U.S. president, and actually it's 64, and there's an incident where apparently a Vietnamese boat, I emphasize boat, has fired upon or interfered with an American naval vessel. There's a great difference in power between the American naval vessel and the Vietnamese boat or gunship or whatever it might have been. And LBJ uses this incident, which was very much trumped up, as an excuse to go to Congress, where he was extremely popular and essentially being seen as carrying on the noble purposes of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the great American president cut short by an assassins plural, bullets, probably assassins plural, November 22nd, 63, and everybody loved JFK, so they are willing to go all the way with LBJ. And so he goes to Congress and says, give me a resolution that says I can use force to deal with the Vietnamese enemy. And so they vote aye, go ahead, do whatever is necessary to defend the Republic of South Vietnam and go to war with what we call, what the Americans are calling North Vietnam. The Vietnamese Democratic Republic. No, it's not quite it. It's no, I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm getting a little bit of a mental block on the actual name of what was North Vietnam, but probably Democratic Republic of Vietnam. I think that's what it was, Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Anyway, so he gets the permission, and then over the next 10 years, 65 to the early 70s, more bombs are dropped on Vietnam than were dropped over the entirety of World War II by everybody. Napalm is used indiscriminately. War crimes up the yin-yang are committed. And there's defoliation of Vietnamese verdure, forestry, using Agent Orange, which then has horrendous complications for newborns, infants, children, not to mention cancers for others. And for all of this, 2 million Vietnamese murdered by the greatest military power on the face of the earth. For what? And they lost. I want to remind you, they lost. They were beaten by people who essentially had very limited resources. And as Malcolm X said, a bowl of rice and a knife. and they brought to heel the world's greatest military power. But to get to the point, they had their war. They wanted the war. They got their war. They had their Bella causis, I think is the Latin for going to war with Vietnam, an illegal war, a war that saw them commit great crimes against humanity, and they never had to pay for it. They've never had to pay for it, and that has only emboldened them now since to try and do the same thing, trying to find some kind of and again not going back very far at all, going back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the lies that were told about weapons of mass destruction, lies that were communicated by the New York Times, by the London Times, news agencies that should have known better, but no, everybody wanted to be embedded with the Allied forces, the coalition of the willing, right? No, hey, when I heard that phrase, coalition of the willing, my mind went back immediately to Leni Riefenstahl and Triumph of the Will, her great film, and truly is a great film, demonstrating the virtues of Nazi Germany. Great lighting, great shots, great sound, and so on, all to, again, propagandize for Hitler, for Nazi Germany. That's the triumph of the will. And you want to call you ahistorical nitwits, you ahistoricist imbeciles. You want to name yourselves the coalition of the willing? You're saying that you're affianced with fascism. Just in that phrasing alone, you're saying, oh yeah, we're happy to be fascists here, right? That just goes to show their own ignorance of their own history. But they depend on everybody else's ignorance to get away with it. All of a sudden I'm thinking about Fidel Castro, who of course was totally opposed to the coalition of the willing and the invasion of Iraq. But I remember there was a demonstration in Havana where people had images of either Bush or the U.S. flag with swastikas painted on it. Now that may seem to some like, oh, that's really heavy-handed. You're going, well, it's Fidel Castro. He's going way too far. On the other hand, the way that invasion was prosecuted, that war was prosecuted, and the murders of untold tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Iraqis was again a horrendous war crime which destabilized the entire Middle East in ways that we are still contending with now. And which did not make the Middle East safe for democracy, in quotation marks, but have actually made it possible, in my personal humble opinion, to roll back the advances that were attempted under the so-called Arab Spring uprisings and search for democracy in various Middle Eastern states at that point under Obama. So I think we have to be very suspicious of all of the claims that are put forward to trigger any kind of armed conflict. We need to be very suspicious of them all and to look at the real causes, which always come out. They always come out. Years later, sometimes it's years, but they always come out about the real causes for war. But at the same time, we know that there were people at the time who were able to say, this is why this is happening. This is why this is occurring. Even though at the time, those persons are often dismissed as cranks, as crazy, as out of touch with necessities of one sort or another. And so, I can only say as just an everyday Canadian citizen that I hope that we will all think very carefully about whatever. I mean, just recently, we had the great scare over the Chinese weather balloons. These are spy balloons. We got to shoot them down. What are they doing? Keeping in mind that everybody's got satellites spying on everybody else anyway. They can see somebody lighting a cigarette. So the idea that we've got to be living in fear of balloons is itself, I think, a signal of the grasping for straws, grasping for something that can be used, held up. I mean, keep in mind that when Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, the Americans instantly said to the Chinese, you better not send any offensive weaponry to Russia. The implication being that, well, if you do that, we'll have an excuse to slap sanctions on you. We'll have an excuse to to ramp up military preparations against you, because then we will see you as being a de facto ally of Russia. On the other hand, we are a de facto ally of NATO in its aggression. Right now, its aggression, supposedly on behalf of Ukraine, but which I also see as being essentially part of a greater game, which is to dislodge the BRIC group of nations as being a counterweight to the West, and to prepare ultimately for some kind of armed campaign against China. If there is no other way for the West, in quotation marks, to force China to somehow agree to not be a great economic power, or to agree to let the West dictate its foreign policy or dictate its domestic policy, for that matter, that in order to try to force China back into a position of vassalage, that we will engage in some kind of military adventurism. And I think that if we were to do that, and I say this only as an ordinary Canadian citizen, I fear for the future of the planet. Some higher ups in the current American regime, I notice I said regime, have said that a war with China would be a catastrophe for everyone. The Chinese have also made it very clear that it would be a catastrophe for the entire planet. So I think that for all of us who want peace, who love peace, who do think that there are peaceful solutions to many world problems, and who recognize the need for international peace in order to resolve the climate crisis, that we need to do everything possible to prevent those who should know better from hurtling us all into an apocalyptic, truly apocalyptic military enterprise that could potentially see the use of nuclear weapons.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
It's truth telling.
Well, when I see in 1 month, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State for the U.S., Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense for the U.S., and Janet Yellen, head of the Federal Reserve Bank, all getting in conversations with Chinese and Beijing-based counterparts, military, economics, finances, foreign relations, and all three of them as emissaries of a president who simply wants to denounce China and its leadership as tyrants and as a tyranny, keeping in mind, as China reminded the United States recently, well, you seem to have a particular problem with your police forces and Black Americans. So, call us a tyranny. We are a tyranny. I don't want to live there. Yeah, China's a tyranny. Sure. On the other hand, it's not. I would definitely prefer, and have lived in the United States. I definitely prefer to live in the United States, and I would never want to prefer to live in China. On the other hand, in some ways, it is a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black, and to use that particular metaphor, deliberately and with just a little bit of irony, yes, China is a dictatorship, but China recently has not invaded anybody. And America has. And not only that, but America has been on a war footing with many, many, many states, including Cuba, going back to the 1960s. So China is aggressive, particularly towards Taiwan, and has been aggressive towards Tibet, which it did take over, which it did invade in the 1950s. And it gave tacit support to the North Koreans during the Korean War. On the other hand, it has not been as perennially aggressive and actually going to war as America itself has been. nor nor has it been openly, flagrantly denying international rules. And the U.S. likes to talk about international rules-based order. Well, why don't you guys sign on to the War Crimes Treaty?
See you in The
Why
Hague.
don't you, yeah, let's see you all in The Hague answering the charges. We'll have you let you have your defense. Bring forward a vigorous defense and so on. But let's see you go on trial for once, as opposed to the tin pot dictators that you often have backed in the past, that who you then decide you no longer need, and you want to see them sitting in The Hague. Well, the problem with all of this, I mean, to sum it all up, I think the real problem here is the simple H word, hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. I mean, come on. You cannot be asking other people to toe the line, respect civil liberties, respect human rights, when you will not do it. When you will not, and when you reserve for yourselves the right to not have to do it. Right? Because you are above everybody else. You are above the law. And don't mind telling everyone that. Bluntly and blatantly. We don't have to adhere to these treaties. We don't have to adhere to a landmine treaty. We don't have to do it. We don't have to bother with respecting prohibitions against cluster munitions. We don't have to worry about that. And we've got our own stockpiles of this and that and the other thing that we're not supposed to use, but we might use it if we have to. We think we need to. We'll go ahead. We've been talking a lot about foreign policy this afternoon, and anybody out there can name me as a foreign policy nitwit and idiot. Please go ahead and do that. On the other hand, I think I have a right to speak as simply a human being and as an inhabitant of this planet, and with a daughter who I hope will grow up in a world that is worthwhile for her to inherit, as opposed to something that's been blasted to smithereens for the sake of somehow preserving the right of 15% of the world's population to use up the vast majority of the world's resources. How can we allow that? How can we need to have a regimen of sharing. I don't care what you want to call it socialism, go ahead. You want to call it capitalism with a human face, please do. I mean, have capitalism with a human face. Let's have that. That would be great, right? But don't tell me that we're going to get there without some degree of sharing, organized, legislated sharing of the resources that we have to sustain human life and our civilizations, which are all great. They're all important. No one civilization is superior to the other. They're all great. The world's faiths, the world's religions, they're all important. They're all great. Nobody has a monopoly on God. Nobody has a monopoly on the gods and goddesses. Nobody does. I'm a Christian. I'm a bad Christian, but I'm a Christian. And I believe my faith. I believe in the African United Baptist Association, Nova Scotia. I believe in being a colored Baptist in Nova Scotia. I believe in that. It's wonderful. It's great, right? I don't need anybody else to believe it. I don't need anybody else to adhere to that church, but I adhere to it. And I'm glad that they let me adhere to it. I don't want them to throw me out of the church anytime. I need to be in the church. I need to be in the right pew in the church. And I'm speaking from the heart, and I say that. On the other hand, I gotta have respect for other people's understandings of divinity. I got to have respect for that. Because whatever God or the gods or the goddesses are, they are immense compared to puny human beings. They are far superior to ourselves in everything. They created the universe. They created the cosmos. They created the conditions for life. They created human beings. However, in whatever process we came along and happen to be here now, they did. They are far superior to all of us and our creeds and our ideologies and so on. We are lucky to have the consciousness that allows us to be able to glimpse the divine, to be able to glimpse it, and to try to approach it in our art. We are so gifted and blessed to have that. And how dare any of us say that we have monopoly on that? That our being Canadian, or our being Christian, or our being this or that, or our being a Nova Scotian, or our being a Rosicrucian, or our being a Texan gives us a monopoly on the understanding of the essence of creativity. You know, coming back to one of your first questions, the whole idea of being an artist, what is holy? What is holy about being an artist is that we get to glimpse the divine. We get to try to channel a tiny bit of the divine into, if the muses, who are themselves emissaries of the divine, if the muses grant us just a tiny bit of their inspiration to allow us to create something which rises to the capacity of being a window, of being a tiny porthole on the divine, then that is the greatest possible blessing that we can have as artists. That is our job, right? You know, poets, artists, musicians, singers who get involved in politics is always dangerous. It's always bad news, right? So everyone, please forgive me for having ventured into the world of the political. I know I've got no right to do it, so forgive me. And I do believe it's the role and the purpose of the artist to create our art first. Art first, everything else second. Art first, family and art first, everything else second. On the other hand, in trying to glimpse the divine, we can also glimpse what is problematic about the way we organize ourselves, the way we organize our economies, the way we organize our governments, the way we respect or disrespect each other internationally. And so it's out of that spirit that I hope I have tried to offer some of my own thoughts, no matter how misguided and incorrect they may be about some matters of global interest right now. And at the same time, I just want to be able to go on writing poetry and publishing it and reciting it and of being as creative as I can possibly be until my final breath leaves my lungs, and whatever I am, disappears. You know, in the poetry class that you so kindly took with me, I think that, Jaya, there was one point where I talk about that word "I," and it is really the most profound word, because we only get to use it while we're here. We only get to use that word while we're here. It can only have meaning while we are each here to use it. And when we're no longer here, the word is just gone.
The expiring eye.
Yeah, the expiring eye.
Alhamdulillah. There you have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. Thank you.
Riled up. Riled up.